SANDHAN, All Gujarat Integrated Classroom.
સેટેલાઇટના માધ્યમથી જોડતી કડી એટલે સંધાન.
Good afternoon. Today we are going to focus on one of the greatest poet of England, William Poetry, and I, along with Mr. Pandya, are supposed to concentrate on the poetry of William Blake. Whenever we focus on any poet, the social setting, the background, the milieu, all these things come to play a very important role, because this period results in giving rise to a poet or any literary artist. William Blake belonged to a period of 1750 to 1800, and this period is known as the decline of classicism period, the period of transition, the period of Dr. Johnson. Here we can say that this decline of classicism means William Blake was in such a situation who was very much caught in cross currents of different attitudes, the predominant attitudes of reasoning, rationing, mannerism, etiquette of classical period, and that too was very much in conflicting with the period which was very much in the offing. This particular period was famous for several changes in the field of politics, history, other areas as well. The chief political trends of this period was the chief political trend of this period was 7 Years' Wars, which was fought by the Britishers against France. The period was dominated by senior elder Pitt. He was no doubt a man of immense administrative and political prowess. Victory over France in 7 years was his first successful gain, and in this process he gained Canada and Indian Empire. After his successful rule, George III came into power, and his period witnessed upheaval in many areas. He ruled 32 years, but he tried to override parliament not by winning the confidence of the political people, but literally bribing the political people, and he created a king's friend around him. Gradually he ruled and literally he misruled, and as a result of this, the most important power, progressive Whigs, were out of power. There were considerable level of discontent among each section of society, and as a result of this revolt was very much palpable in different colonies also. Rebellion broke out in American colonies, because American colonies had started reasserting themselves. France, Spain, Netherlands supported colonies. Americans were literally turned rebel. England was defeated, and this particular period was is known as American War Independence, and American gained independence in 1776. To follow up, we come across social and economic development of the period. This period witnessed tremendous spurt in the field of science, and Britain turned out to be the first industrial country. It started dominating not only internationally but in every arena of international areas. We have Hargreaves spinning jenny, Arkwright's water frame, Cartwright's power loom, Watt's steam engine. All these are symbols of what we can say the temples of excellence in the field of science and economics. As a result of tremendous development in this field, enterprises, middle class people started migrating to town, city areas. They started setting up their own small factories, and this was promoted even by tremendous spurt in the field of publications as well. There was a heavy rush from rural areas to town. Workers started migrating to town in order to get themselves promoted economically and at the same time in search of jobs. Royal Academy was established, middle class entrepreneurs established Chamber of Commerce, and this was literally, we can say, an institution which started dominating the policies in other areas. Then we come over to economic impact of the nation. As we witness, this period was dominated by industrial revolution, so naturally there was a collateral development in the field of economics as well. People started getting themselves promoted, getting themselves economically rich, so naturally there was a rush for money earning, but it had a very bad effect on the overall political and social scenario as well. What happened? Workers started migrating to cities, and in order to live up to their own expectations, they had to work hard. So there were no laws to protect the interest of the workers, because most of the entrepreneurs, enterprises were very much interested in making money, and at the same time, workers were also in a position to reach themselves by earning money. So they had to live in very unhygienic condition. There were no limits to working hours. There was naturally a collateral price rise, heavy taxations, and as a result there was a social divide. Here we can find a clear-cut yawning gap between rich and poor people. Since town and cities were places where all these enterprises came into existence, that's why in literature towns became symbol of greed and misery. Contrary tendencies created an area of turmoil. Naturally, when have and have-nots were there, there was an inevitable presence of conflict also. But one remarkable thing in this particular period was religion. Religion practically remained unperturbed, but one thing was very much present there. It was a rise of Methodists. Methodists were, you can say, a group which kept themselves related to more rigid and austere way of life. So naturally they started asserting themselves. They held their first conference in 1744 and separated from church. Now gradually we move to some of the characteristics of literature of this period. This period, witnessed decline of Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism was the period which witnessed Dr. Johnson in his supremacy, but there was a contrary trend also, because this particular period was a period of decadence also. Some of the opposite forces started crossing swords with those sentiments, those theories, those attitudes of classical period. Naturally, sentiment entered. There was a complete decline of heroic couplet, decline of classical spirit. As we know, most of the classical writers or poets demonstrated their views by taking recourse to heroic couplet, because that was a device through which they can express their ideas very clearly. One more thing is very important here. Ballad and lyric revived, desire to express subtlest human emotions. Now we can see here there is a shift from reasoning to human emotions. In fact, it was during this period only old plays of Shakespeare, Dryden, Congreve were presented, but there were very few viewers. Now the milieu of politics, history and philosophy. Political writers, we have Edmund Burke. He was one of the greatest writers of this particular period. Because of his greatness, he was termed as English Demosthenes, and his House of Commons speech on American taxation was a remarkable speech ever delivered by any political leader. But basically, he was a political philosopher. Philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas on the sublime and beautiful indicates his inclination more towards political philosophy than towards radical philosophy. Then we have Thomas Paine. He was very close to William Blake, and William Blake was very much under his influence. Thomas Paine loved liberty. When this word liberty comes, means natural influence of French Revolution comes into being, and because of this we can say he had revolutionary zeal and he was a courageous fighter. Then we have William Godwin, 1756-1836. His work on political justice is a very remarkable work. It had a very good impact on the contemporary writers as well. But here I would like to mention Mary Wollstonecraft. In fact, her presence in this array of political writer is important because she was the first woman for asserting voice of feminism, and she was the first woman who asserted rights of women, because at that point it was very difficult for any woman to come forward and start asking for women's right. Then we have list of historians. David Hume, he was a skeptic who believed in cultural development. Then we have William Robertson, we have Edward Gibson. In fact, Gibson is a greatest of all English historians. His Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire traces ages of Trojan to Constantinople, because here he tries to put the entire thought process into a historical prospect or perspective which includes all around. Next, we have philosophy and research. We have David Hartley, David Hume, and Adam Smith. Adam Smith is very important here, and he became a household name during his period. His famous speech and work on the wealth of nation is opus magnum. Why? Because in this particular wealth of nations, he literally set the ball rolling for some of the economic theories of that period. Then we have Edmund Burke. He also emphasized the need of greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. Then we come over to transitional poet. This particular point at this lecture is very important. We say transitional because this was a period which started witnessing some of the poets or some of the writers who literally started asserting and dominating the scenario, and hence we call them precursors of the Romantic Revival. In this particular period, we have sentimentalism entered poetry. We have sentimentalism seized the drama and the novel of the 18th century. 17th century accepted rigidity and rationalism of French model. English culture became city-oriented. Heroic couplet used for clear statement of ideas. Here we can say that 17th century laid more emphasis on rigidity, mannerism, and here this particular period, which was dominated by industrial resurgence, we can say, English had become city oriented, but it had already created a section in the society what we call common people, and they started concentrating on common people. Then individual freedom in expression and thought. As we know, middle of the 18th century, Old English love of individual freedom in expression and thought began reasserting itself. Right from very beginning, Old English period or English period, we can say, majority of the poets and writers always believed in individual freedom in expression and thought. Here, two important persons or poets, we can say, Thomson's Seasons was written in blank verse. and it was first indication of coming change. Rich description of landscape and sympathy for common people. Here landscape comes into picture, which is in sharp contrast to some of the scenes which depicted by the classical period writers, where nature never finds any place. Then we have Young's night thoughts. He focused on uncertainty of life in the manner of Milton, and very crucial point, celebrated imagination and intuition. Process of revolt in poetry was already set in motion by the earlier poets like Thomson and Youngs. Here, this particular revolt in poetry was quickened by two publications in the year 1765. Thomas Percy, he was a North Country clergyman. He had collection of ballads, historical songs and metrical romances. His famous work, Relics of Ancient Poetry, was widely acclaimed and had profound effect in changing the taste of both the writers and the readers. I would like to mention here that for any social life or for any literary creative work of arts, there is a mutual process of sanctioning and challenging. Earlier on, mannerism, reason, rationality, these things were established. But with the passage of time, these writers and these poets started posing challenges to them. Then we have another one, French Mallet's Northern Antiquities, which was translated by Percy. In fact, here one point is very important. He created interest in medieval mythology and manner, significant tilt towards spiritual aspect of nature. The another one, James Macpherson. In fact, his work, the works of Ocean, which Blake himself has admitted on number of occasions that he worked under the influence of Ocean. It was a translation from the legendary Gaelic bard of the 3rd century,